You know those dreams that cling to your mind, wrapping around your thoughts like dark tendrils long after you've woken up? The kind that leaves you questioning whether you're truly awake, or some remnant of the dream is still with you, lurking in the shadows of your room. I'm Arthur Sinclair, a retired clockmaker, someone who's spent countless hours in solitude, surrounded by the rhythmic ticking of clocks, each beat a reminder of time's relentless march forward. But there's one particular clock, and one night, that changed everything I thought I knew about reality. What began as a seemingly harmless dream soon turned into a descent into darkness, where the line between what's real and imagined was shredded, leaving me stranded in a place of terror. It was a cold, quiet night. I had just closed my shop after a long day of repairs, each clock carefully wound down, every pendulum still, the silence almost oppressive. As I drifted into sleep, my mind felt unusually heavy, as if weighed down by an unseen force. The dream began innocently enough. I was in a dimly lit room, one I didn't recognize, yet something about it gnawed at my senses, a haunting familiarity that I couldn't place. Shadows clung to the walls, stretching long and twisted, and the only source of light came from an eerie glow emanating from a grandfather clock. It was massive, its wood worn and cracked, its hands frozen at midnight, a time that seemed to hum with an unspoken dread. As I moved closer, the clock's minute hand shifted, breaking the silence with a deep, hollow tick that echoed in my bones. The closer I got, the more I felt as if the clock was watching me, its face looming over me like a silent guardian of secrets best left undisturbed. I reached out, my hand trembling, drawn to the cold brass pendulum, and as I touched it, a sudden chill surged through me. The room seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, denser, pressing against me. I wanted to pull away, but my hand was frozen in place, as if the clock had trapped me in its grip. Its ticking grew louder, each beat sounding like a heartbeat that wasn't my own. And then, in one deafening, bone-rattling tick, the clock's hands shifted backwards, the time slipping into the past, dragging me along with it. As the hands continued their backward journey, images began to flicker around me, faces distorted in anguish, whispers filling the room like the sighs of the forgotten. I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting, as if I was intruding on a realm not meant for the living. And just as suddenly as it began, everything went silent. The clock stopped, its hands frozen once more, but this time, I sensed that something had changed. I could feel it, a presence, a shadow that had seeped into the very core of me, a dark tether that bound me to that cursed clock. I wanted to scream, to wake up, but the silence around me was thick, suffocating, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. If you're drawn to the eerie, the unexplained, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and stay with me as I unravel this nightmare that refuses to let me go. Because the story I'm about to tell is not for the faint of heart. It's for those who dare to question reality, who are willing to face the unknown and discover what lies beyond the veil of dreams. It started like any other night, but this time, my sleep felt disturbingly heavy, like a descent into deep, dark water. When I opened my eyes within the dream, I was standing alone in an unfamiliar place, a room that seemed to breathe with age, drenched in shadows that clung to every corner. The walls were lined with heavy, dark wood, their surfaces scratched and scarred as though they'd endured centuries of secrets. And then, I saw it, a massive, ominous clock dominating the far side of the room. Its face loomed over me, pale and cracked, with hands frozen in an unnatural stillness. It was a clock I had never seen, yet somewhere in the recesses of my mind, it felt uncannily familiar, like a relic from a half-forgotten nightmare. As I took my first step forward, a thick, metallic scent hit me, something like old brass mixed with a faint trace of decay, sharp and invasive. The air was dense, pressing down on me as though I'd walked into a tomb, each breath heavy with a damp chill that raised the hairs on my arms. The silence was profound, almost deafening, broken only by a low, rhythmic ticking. It echoed from the clock, yet the hands remained unmoving, as if the ticking came from the depths of something hidden, something alive within its wooden frame. And then, out of nowhere, there was another sound, a faint, scraping noise like metal claws dragging across stone. My heart hammered as I scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet that unsettling sound persisted, slithering into my ears and gnawing at my nerves. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn and leave, to break free from this oppressive place, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The ground beneath me was cold, and I could feel an almost sticky sensation, as if the floor was coated in a thin layer of something thick and congealed. Each step I took was met with that slight, sickening resistance, as though I were treading on a forgotten, desecrated ground. As I approached the clock, a soft whisper filled the room. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakably there, a murmur that seemed to dance in the shadows, curling around me like a serpent. I strained to make out the words, but they slipped through my mind like water through fingers, leaving only a sense of dread in their wake. The whisper grew louder, an insistent chant that wove itself into the ticking of the clock, each beat aligning with the pulse of the whispers. It was as if the clock was speaking to me, reaching out across the veil of time, pulling me deeper into its dark, hidden history. Then, as if in response to my growing fear, the minute hand of the clock shifted with a slow, deliberate creak. The room filled with a heavy, echoing thud that reverberated through my bones, rattling every thought in my mind. The clock had moved forward by 1 single minute, yet that simple motion carried with it a weight I could not explain, a dread that felt like 1,000 eyes turning their gaze upon me. I felt trapped, ensnared by the hypnotic pull of that ancient, cursed timepiece. Each beat of the clock grew louder, transforming into a heartbeat that wasn't mine, filling the room with a relentless, suffocating rhythm. My skin prickled with the sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of sight, hiding in the shadows, observing me with a patience that felt timeless and malevolent. And then, from somewhere deeper in the house, a door creaked open, a distant but unmistakable sound that pierced the silence like a warning. I didn't know what awaited me on the other side, but I could feel it. A presence, a darkness that lay hidden within the heart of this dream. In that moment, I knew this was no ordinary nightmare. This was something far darker, a twisted reality that had seeped into my mind, forcing me to confront secrets buried in shadows. The clock had beckoned me, its chime an invitation, or perhaps a curse. And as I stood frozen, caught between terror and curiosity, the whispers grew louder, urging me to take another step, to delve deeper into the unknown. As I ventured further into the dimly lit room, the atmosphere thickened, as if I were wading through a dense fog of dread. Shadows clung to the walls, twisting and shifting as though they had a life of their own. The room seemed to pulse with a silent malice, and every object within it appeared slightly wrong. There was an uncanny strangeness, like an eerie, invisible force that nudged objects just out of place when I wasn't looking. The ancient furniture creaked softly, as if whispering secrets I was never meant to hear. Every time I turned, the grandfather clock loomed closer, like it was following me. The hands still hadn't moved since that disturbing shift, but the clock emitted a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. And then, just beyond my vision, I caught glimpses of movement. Shadows darted in my peripheral vision, only to vanish the moment I tried to focus on them. I could feel a gaze on me, a sensation that drilled into the back of my skull, an unblinking stare that sent chills crawling down my spine. I began to explore the rest of the room, drawn to each corner by an insatiable curiosity tangled with fear. As I ran my fingers along a dusty table, I felt an odd sensation beneath my hand, something slick and cold. I looked down, and my fingers came away smeared with a dark, oily residue, as if the very walls of the room were bleeding out secrets long buried. The smell of aged wood mixed with something else, something foul and metallic, turning my stomach as I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread clawing at me. Suddenly, I heard a whisper. It wasn't like the faint murmurs from before. This was sharper, closer, an urgent hiss that slithered directly into my ear. "Turn back," it warned, in a voice that felt both foreign and chillingly familiar. I spun around, but there was nothing, only the endless, watchful shadows, thickening as if savoring my fear. My mind raced, grasping for a rational explanation, but each theory crumbled under the weight of the surreal terror that enveloped me. Then I noticed something impossible. On the walls, faint handprints appeared, smudges in the dust that hadn't been there before. Some were small, like a child's, while others were grotesquely large, the shapes twisted and unnatural, as though the hands had too many fingers or the joints bent in ways that defied anatomy. Each print seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were fresh, left by something alive, something watching and waiting. My eyes drifted back to the grandfather clock. Its face had changed. The numbers were no longer ordinary Roman numerals. They had transformed into bizarre symbols, twisted characters that seemed to writhe and contort, barely holding their form. The symbols glowed faintly in the dim light, radiating an eerie, otherworldly aura that drew me closer against my will. My head throbbed with each tick, each pulse of that relentless, unearthly hum, as if the clock were embedding its rhythm into my mind. At that moment, I caught sight of a door in the corner, one I hadn't noticed before. It stood slightly ajar, casting a sliver of light that flickered like candle flame, fragile and uncertain. I hesitated, but something deeper than curiosity compelled me forward. A sense of inevitability, like I was being pulled toward it by an invisible hand. As I reached for the door, I heard a faint, distorted laughter from beyond, a sound that didn't belong to this world. My hand trembled as it hovered above the doorknob, the air around it cold and thick, as if warning me of the horrors that lay beyond. But despite every fiber of my being screaming to stop, I couldn't turn back. With a deep, unsteady breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside, where the flickering light grew dimmer, like it was being swallowed by an unseen darkness. My heart pounded, and every muscle in my body tensed, knowing that whatever awaited me on the other side would unravel my sanity, plunging me deeper into this nightmare I could no longer escape. The room beyond the door was smaller and darker than the last, a suffocating space that seemed to press in on me from all sides. Shadows gathered thickly around the edges, forming shapes that slithered and writhed, almost as if they were alive, feeding off my fear. In the center of the room stood a single object, a clockmaker's workbench, draped in layers of cobwebs and dust, abandoned as if it had been left untouched for centuries. On top of the bench lay a peculiar clock, smaller than the grandfather clock I'd seen earlier, but just as ominous. It ticked irregularly, its hands jerking with each tick, as though resisting time itself. My gaze was drawn to the clock face, which was unlike any I had ever seen. Its numbers were twisted, warped, barely recognizable, and they shifted every time I looked at them, morphing into strange symbols that pulsed with a faint, sickly glow. It was as though the clock were alive, its mechanisms imbued with a dark, unnatural intelligence, aware of my presence. I felt a compulsion to reach out, to touch it, as though it held answers I desperately needed, yet some primal instinct screamed at me to turn and run. But my hand, against my own will, drifted closer, fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, tarnished metal. As soon as I made contact, a violent jolt surged through me, like an electric shock, yet far colder, sharper, cutting into the very essence of my mind. The room shifted, the walls seeming to stretch and bend, warping around me as a piercing sound filled the air, a scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded wildly, my breath shallow and quick, but I couldn't look away from the clock as its hands began to spin backward, faster and faster, dragging me into a spiral of darkness. The shadows around me thickened, and within them, I could see faces, hollow, gaunt faces with eyes sunken and dark, their mouths frozen in silent screams. They reached out, their hands clawing at the air, fingers twisted and elongated, stretching toward me as if begging for release. My mind felt like it was tearing apart, pulled between two realms, caught in a battle between the living and the dead. I tried to scream, to release the terror that was tearing through me, but no sound escaped my lips. I was trapped voiceless as the faces grew clearer, closer, their eyes filled with a sorrow and fury that defied the boundaries of this world. Suddenly, the clock hands stopped, and everything fell silent. The faces disappeared, melting back into the shadows, leaving me alone in the dim, oppressive quiet. I dared to hope it was over, that I was free. But then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the room, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with eyes that glowed a dull, malevolent red, like embers in a dying fire. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze piercing into me, a silent accusation, as though I had trespassed into a place I had no right to be. The figure raised one skeletal hand, and in its grasp was a small, tarnished pocket watch, its surface etched with the same twisted symbols I'd seen on the larger clock. As it held the watch out toward me, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a certainty that whatever I did next would bind me to this place forever. My mind raced, scrambling for escape, but my body remained frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow, deliberate, each step echoing with a hollow, metallic sound that reverberated through my bones. In a final act of desperation, I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to break free from this nightmare. But instead, I felt a cold, bony hand on my shoulder, gripping me with a strength that defied its skeletal appearance. My heart nearly stopped as I opened my eyes, coming face to face with the figure, its empty, burning eyes locked onto mine. It leaned in close, its breath cold and sour, whispering words in a language I couldn't understand, but that resonated in my mind like the tolling of a bell. The words clawed at my sanity, filling my thoughts with darkness, dread, and an overwhelming sense of despair. And then, in a single, horrifying instant, everything shifted. I was back in my room, the shadows gone, the air silent. I bolted upright, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as though it would burst from my chest. Yet something was wrong. My hands still felt cold, the lingering touch of that skeletal figure etched into my skin. I looked down, and there, in my palm, was the pocket watch, its twisted symbols glowing faintly in the dim light of my room. The dream hadn't ended. It had followed me, crossed over into my reality, binding me to whatever dark force lay within that clock. In that moment, I knew this was far from over. In the days that followed, the dream, if I could even call it that, refused to fade. It clung to me like a dark mist, filling every quiet moment with an unsettling weight, a constant reminder that something had shifted in my world. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clock, its warped symbols twisting and reshaping in the shadows of my mind. And then there was the pocket watch. It lay on my bedside table, an impossible relic from a place that shouldn't exist. Its surface was tarnished and cold, yet the symbols etched into it seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat I could almost hear, as if it was alive in some dark, inexplicable way. Driven by an instinctual need for answers, I started searching for any clues about the clock. My first stop was the local library, where I pored over old records, combing through anything I could find on clocks, haunted artifacts, or tales of cursed timepieces. Hours passed, but nothing seemed to match the strange object I had seen. Frustration began to creep in, a nagging feeling that I was chasing shadows, until I stumbled upon a photograph tucked away in a dusty corner of the archives. It was an old, faded picture of a grand mansion, decrepit and overgrown with vines. But what caught my eye was the clock visible through one of its shattered windows. It was the very same clock from my dream, the one with those twisted, eldritch symbols. A cold shiver ran through me as I scanned the caption, The Blackwood Manor, abandoned after mysterious disappearances in 1892. The text went on to describe a series of unsolved vanishings, townsfolk who had simply walked into the house and never returned. Legends spoke of strange sounds echoing from within, an incessant ticking that never stopped, even though no one had been inside to wind the clock for decades. Some claimed to have seen figures in the windows at night, dark shapes that watched, unblinking, as if waiting for something or someone. I dug deeper, uncovering newspaper articles from the time, each one more disturbing than the last. Witnesses spoke of nightmares, whispers that followed them after venturing too close to the mansion, and strange marks, symbols that appeared on their skin only to vanish without a trace. It all sounded horrifyingly familiar, each detail matching my own experience. My blood ran cold as I realized that the dream had somehow tied me to this place, as if the clock itself had reached across time to pull me into its twisted web. Obsessed and terrified, I began tracking down anyone who might know more. Locals were reluctant to talk, their faces pale at the mere mention of Blackwood Manor. Some even crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath, as though the house was cursed. But one old man, a caretaker named Ezra, agreed to speak with me. His voice was a gravelly whisper, eyes darting nervously as he recounted the stories he'd heard growing up. "That clock," he said, voice trembling, "it don't just tell time. It takes it. Folks say it traps souls, keeps them in its gears, winding their lives down to nothing." He leaned closer, his breath raspy. "Once you see it, it don't ever let you go. You're marked." I felt a surge of panic, but forced myself to stay calm, to gather whatever information I could. Ezra explained that the clock had once belonged to an infamous clockmaker who dabbled in dark rituals, using time itself as a conduit to summon forces beyond our world. He claimed the clockmaker's spirit was still bound to the timepiece, trapped in an endless cycle of torment. "People go looking for answers," Ezra warned, "but all they find is a nightmare that don't let them go." Determined but shaken, I returned home, mind racing with what I'd learned. As night fell, a creeping dread filled my apartment, a suffocating tension that seemed to thicken the very air around me. I knew I should leave it alone, let the mystery remain unsolved. But some part of me, a part that felt oddly like the clock's relentless ticking, pushed me to go deeper, to face whatever truth lay hidden in the shadows of Blackwood Manor. I could feel it now, an invisible thread linking me to that cursed place. Haunted by the revelations, I found myself standing at the edge of Blackwood Manor just before twilight, a twisted silhouette against the fading light. The mansion loomed above me, its structure warped and decaying, like a living thing frozen in agony. Ivy and shadows clung to its crumbling walls, twisting around broken windows that stared back at me like hollow, empty eyes. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to run, but I knew I couldn't. Not now. The clock's call was stronger than fear. It had gripped something deep within me, a compulsion I couldn't shake. My hands trembled as I pushed open the rusted iron gate, its screech tearing through the silence like a warning, echoing across the empty grounds. Stepping inside the manor was like crossing into another world. The air grew colder, damp and thick, with a foul odor of rot and mildew that clawed at my throat. Shadows pooled in every corner, twisting and shifting, as if alive, watching my every move. Dust filled the air, swirling around me like whispered secrets, and the house itself seemed to breathe, each creak of the floorboards a low, mournful sigh. It was as if the manor was alive, its ancient bones creaking, groaning under the weight of memories too dark to be remembered. And amidst it all, I could feel the clock's presence, pulling me deeper into its twisted lair. Each room I passed felt eerily familiar, as if I had been here before, maybe in another life, or perhaps in some fractured memory lost to time. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling and torn, revealing symbols underneath. Symbols I recognized from my nightmares, twisted marks that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, filling me with a sense of dread that prickled my skin. I ran my hand over one of the symbols, and an icy chill shot through my arm, a sensation so cold it felt like needles digging into my flesh. As I explored, a faint ticking sound began to emerge, coming from somewhere deep within the house. The sound grew louder with each step, resonating through the empty halls, filling the silence with a sinister rhythm that matched my heartbeat. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a reminder that I was no longer alone. I felt eyes on me, shadows lurking in doorways, figures flitting just beyond my line of sight, dissolving the moment I tried to focus on them. But the ticking remained, constant, unwavering, a call I couldn't resist. In one dimly lit corridor, I encountered a figure, a frail old man with hollow eyes and a face that seemed etched with the same symbols on the walls, his skin pale as bone, his clothes ragged and faded. His gaze pierced me, filled with a strange mix of fear and understanding, as if he knew exactly why I was there. "You're here for the clock, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice raspy, barely more than a breath. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with fear. "It's been waiting for you," he continued, his eyes wide with terror. "It called to me once, too long ago. But beware, for once it marks you, it never lets you go. You are its bound to its cycle." Without another word, he faded into the shadows, leaving me alone with only the relentless ticking as my guide. Heart pounding, I continued down the corridor, each step feeling heavier, as though the air itself was pressing against me, thick with unseen eyes and countless horrors that had soaked into the walls over decades. The smell of decay grew stronger, mingling with a metallic scent of old, rusted gears, like the very essence of time rotting away in the heart of the house. Finally, I reached a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light seeped through the crack, casting distorted shadows that twisted and writhed as though alive. I pushed the door open, and there, in the center of the room, stood the grandfather clock, just as I remembered it from my dream. It was larger than life, towering over me, its wooden frame dark and glistening, as though stained with something far older and more sinister than mere age. The symbols on its face seemed to crawl, rearranging themselves in a pattern I couldn't comprehend, yet something about them felt deeply, disturbingly familiar. The room was silent, save for the steady, pounding tick of the clock. I could feel it resonating within me, filling my veins with a cold dread, a sense that this was not just a clock but something alive, something that fed on fear, on time, on the very souls of those who dared to come too close. My hand reached out, trembling, drawn to the face of the clock despite every instinct screaming at me to stop. But before I could touch it, the clock's door swung open on its own, revealing an inky void within, an abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly, devouring the light. And from that darkness came a whisper, soft and chilling, curling around me like smoke. It was a voice, or perhaps many voices speaking as one, weaving tales of despair and torment, stories of those who had been consumed by the clock, trapped in its eternal cycle. My mind was filled with visions of faces frozen in terror, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams, suspended in time, bound to the gears and springs that kept the clock alive. The clock wasn't just marking time, it was devouring it, consuming every moment, every life it touched, leaving nothing but empty shells behind. The void seemed to pull me in, a relentless force tugging at my soul, threatening to drag me into its endless darkness. I fought against it, but my body felt weak, as if the life was draining from me, slipping away with each tick of the clock. In a final, desperate act, I yanked my hand back, stumbling away from the clock, gasping for air as the room spun around me. The ticking grew louder, almost mocking, as if the clock knew I couldn't escape its pull forever. I fled from the room, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls as the house seemed to close in around me, the shadows deeper, darker, filled with silent watchers that knew I had barely escaped for now. In the heart of Blackwood Manor, surrounded by thick shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, I found myself drawn back to that cursed clock. I had tried to leave, to break free from the nightmare that clung to me like a second skin, but some dark force compelled me to return, pulling me closer with every beat of my racing heart. The clock loomed before me now, larger than ever, its face a pale, cracked mask staring back at me with a silent, hungry gaze. The hands no longer pointed to any discernible hour. Instead, they had twisted into grotesque shapes, a maddening spiral that seemed to trap my gaze, pulling me deeper with each passing second. On the ground before the clock, barely visible in the dim light, lay a small, leather-bound journal covered in dust and cobwebs. I knelt to pick it up, the old leather cold and brittle in my hands, and opened it to reveal yellowed pages filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. The entries spoke of dreams, of visions filled with shadows and ticking sounds, all leading back to the clock. The journal belonged to someone who had been consumed by it, someone who had lost everything, including his sanity, in his quest to unravel its secrets. As I read, a shiver ran down my spine. Each entry mirrored my own experiences, as if I were reading my future, a fate that had already been sealed. One passage in particular caught my eye. The clock is a doorway, a gate to something far older and darker than this world. Each tick draws the unwary closer, binding them to its power, a cycle of fear and madness that no one escapes. Time is its hunger, and souls are its feast. My blood turned to ice as I realized what this meant. This clock didn't just measure time, it consumed it, feeding on those who dared to come too close, trapping them in an endless loop of terror. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the room darkened further as an oppressive silence settled over me. I felt a presence behind me, and slowly, with a dread that turned my stomach, I turned to face it. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure from my dreams, a skeletal shape cloaked in darkness, with hollow eyes that burned with a red, malevolent glow. It watched me with a silent intensity, as if measuring my worth, deciding whether I was fit to join the ranks of those it had claimed before me. The figure raised one bony hand, pointing directly at the clock, as though inviting me, no, demanding me, to look closer, to accept my fate. With trembling hands, I approached the clock, my mind screaming for me to stop, but my body moved as if under a spell. The door to the clock creaked open, revealing its inner workings, a maze of gears and springs, each one covered in symbols that pulsed with a sickly, unnatural light. My gaze drifted to the pendulum, and in its dark, reflective surface, I saw not my own face, but countless faces, trapped and frozen in expressions of agony, their eyes wide with terror. They seemed to reach out, their hands pressing against the glass, silently begging for release, for an escape that would never come. I felt the cold, skeletal hand of the figure rest on my shoulder, sending a shock of ice through my body, rooting me in place. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, each one pleading, cursing, crying out for salvation. My vision blurred as I felt my own essence, my very soul, being drawn toward the clock, as if it were siphoning my life force, devouring me in the same way it had consumed those who came before. And then, in a final, desperate moment, I felt something, a choice. The clock seemed to offer me a way out, but at a terrible cost. It would release me, break its grip, but only if I offered it something in return. The figure leaned close, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, filling my mind with images of despair, loss, and endless darkness. The cost was high, a part of me, a piece of my soul, an eternal bond to the clock that would leave me forever marked, forever haunted. But if I refused, I knew I would become one of those trapped within its depths, a prisoner in a timeless cycle of horror. With a shaking breath, I whispered my acceptance, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me like a shroud. The figure stepped back, its gaze shifting from menacing to satisfied, and for a brief moment, I saw the hint of a smile, a grotesque, hollow expression of triumph. The clock's ticking slowed, its hands finally coming to rest, and I felt the icy grip around my soul loosen, releasing me from its clutches. I stumbled back, gasping for air, the room spinning around me as the shadows began to dissolve, retreating into the corners, taking their secrets with them. As I stumbled out of Blackwood Manor, the silence was deafening, broken only by the faint, lingering echo of the clock's ticking, a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I knew then that I had made a pact with something ancient and dark, something that would never fully let me go. The clock had given me my freedom, but at a cost that I could feel deep within me, a hollow emptiness that would never heal. And now, as I look back on that night, I realized the true horror wasn't the clock or the shadows, but the knowledge that someday it will come for me again. Because once you've been marked, once you've heard the call of the Blackwood clock, you are bound to it forever, a prisoner of time, waiting for the final tick. Emerging from the oppressive gloom of Blackwood Manor, I staggered into the cold night air, the chill biting at my skin like the icy fingers of the shadows I had just escaped. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears as I glanced back at the mansion, its silhouette dark and ominous against the moonlit sky. I could still hear the faint ticking of the clock resonating in my mind, an unsettling reminder of the pact I had made, a deal struck with something far beyond my understanding. The weight of that choice hung heavy on my soul, a palpable dread that clung to me, as if the shadows had followed, refusing to release their grip. The streets were eerily quiet as I stumbled away from the manor, the world outside seeming too bright, too normal, too unaware of the horror that lurked just beyond its edges. I had escaped the clock's grasp, but at what cost? My thoughts spiraled, overwhelmed by images of the faces I had seen trapped within its depths, their silent screams echoing in my mind. I could still feel the chill of that skeletal hand on my shoulder, the cold whisper of the figure who would offer me an escape with a price I would never fully comprehend. Was I free? Or had I merely traded one nightmare for another? Days turned into nights, and yet the clock haunted my thoughts. I tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, but no matter how hard I tried, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. I began to notice things, a flicker of movement in the corners of my vision, shadows that seemed to linger a moment too long. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, convinced that something was following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The ticking that had once been a distant sound was now a constant thrum in my head, growing louder, more insistent, a reminder of the dark bargain I had struck. It was then that I noticed the symbol, the same grotesque mark I had seen etched into the clock and in the journal, appearing in the most unexpected places. A fleeting glance in a storefront window, a pattern in the peeling paint of a wall, even in the clouds above, twisting in shapes that felt deliberately placed. Each sighting sent a fresh wave of dread crashing over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was still out there, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. The darkness I had briefly escaped was creeping back into my life, and with it, the unsettling realization that my ordeal was far from over. One fateful night, as I lay in bed, the ticking sound grew louder, pulsing through my veins like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. It felt as if the clock itself was calling to me, drawing me back into its depths. The room grew colder, shadows deepening as a dense fog rolled in through the window, wrapping around me like a shroud. I pulled the covers tighter, but the oppressive sensation of being watched intensified until I couldn't ignore it any longer. Mustering all my courage, I climbed out of bed and moved toward the window, peering out into the night. What I saw froze me in place. A figure standing in the middle of the street, cloaked in darkness, its features obscured. It was motionless, facing my apartment, as if waiting for something or someone. My heart raced as I felt an unshakable sense of dread, an instinct screaming at me to hide, to retreat from this unseen terror. But curiosity and fear bound me in place, and as I stared, I recognized the shape, the essence of that same shadowy figure from Blackwood Manor. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure raised its hand, pointing directly at me, as if to beckon me forward. The gesture sent a jolt of fear coursing through me, igniting every instinct to flee. I staggered back, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but it was too late. I had already looked into the abyss, and now it was staring back, drawing me back into its dark embrace. In that moment, a wave of realization washed over me. The clock was not merely a relic of the past. It was a living entity, a predator that feasted on the souls it had ensnared, and I was now part of its web. The clock had not let me go. It had merely bided its time, and now it was ready to reclaim what it believed was rightfully its. As I scrambled back, the figure began to dissolve into the shadows, and I felt a pull, an insistent tug at the very core of my being, urging me to follow. Panic surged through me, but deep down, I knew I had to confront this nightmare once and for all. The true terror was not just the clock or the shadows, but the realization that I had become entwined in a story that was far from over, a story that was still unfolding, filled with dread and mystery. With every fiber of my being urging me to turn away, I stood at the precipice, knowing that whatever lay ahead would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. Was the clock truly behind me, or had it become an inescapable part of who I was? The line between the real and imagined had blurred, and as I stared into the darkening night, I understood that the final chapter was yet to be written. And so I ask you, dear listener, do you dare to confront the shadows that loom in your own life? What would you sacrifice to escape a nightmare that refuses to let go? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more tales of terror. And remember, sometimes the darkest stories are the ones that never truly end.